You're muted.
Yes, I removed it. So are people here familiar with the work of Robert Michel, the one of the what is it? The Iron Law of Oligarchy. Is anyone familiar? Robert Michel, German. He published his work in 1915, I think, or 13, right before the First World War. And the title is Political Organizations. And so Bernard, it kind of complements what you're saying, but it's like a subtext, so to say, that there are no associations really, because the things that claim to be associations actually tacitly evolve in a hierarchy. And Robert Michel, I don't know how to pronounce his name, he actually pointed that out by studying the unions in Germany and kind of pointing out once an organization has been formed, the leadership kind of somehow gets separated from the members, and then the leadership, by virtue of that, there are only 24 hours in a day, and you can only talk with so many people, a span of control at the same time. So the leadership becomes a little clique in itself, the famous vanguard of Lenin. And then that vanguard kind of takes over the organization and runs it exactly as any hierarchical organization. But it still gives the illusion that the members have an opportunity to participate, and that delusion can become a reality, but then the members really need to do a very, very intensive effort to be in touch with the management.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Jamie. I've just found him on Wikipedia, Robert Michel's, and he's quite right to point out how these associations, in Jacques' terms, transform themselves into hierarchies. Jacques says that that's really a separate subject, that how associations should be managed, should be run, given they've got a kind of a board of directors and so on. So it's a separate topic from Jacques' concept of the management accountability hierarchy. But you're quite right. I mean, we also have to look at what happened in the United States with the trades union movement there, in terms of power and corruption and so on. I mean, they were initially formed to help and protect workers, and in the end they became essentially run by gangsters who exploited the workers.
Yeah. So can I ask Bernard where cooperatives and charities fit in with those?
Well, there are associations at the level of governance and management, as I understand it. And the key point is that it's an association of some sort that decides to employ people to get work done. So, and there may be mixed up.
I sort of find those categories very limiting. My research looked at people in organizations, and I identified different characteristics between cooperatives, small charities. Big charities tend to be much like a business, like you're talking about. Small religions and big religions. And if you want to work somewhere where you're happy, go to a small charity or a small religion. Because when I asked, what I would do was use social identity theory from organizational psychology. And I would create a strong feeling of us. I would ask all the people in the room, what makes us, what are we, who are we, what do we do? And then I'd suddenly ask them, who's them? If we're us, who's them? And in almost everything to do with business, they would all look at the floor. And the answer was the management. And in some places I went to, there was open hostility towards the management. When I walked into Chichester railway station, I couldn't find an office that was open. So I went up to the man at the gate and I said to him, look, I'm doing research into this. And he shouted across the whole, a busy concourse to his mate, here, Fred, this idiot wants to talk to our management about efficiency. the current status of these organizations you're talking about are not happy places to be.
Jonathan, did you participate in the previous discussion involving Lucio and Lute about hospital?
No, I thought it started at 3, so I came in a bit late.
Oh, because I haven't shown the slides because that was the theme I talked to, was organizational psychology and the creation of us and them, and the conflicts between management and work. The culture of the factory floor is very different from what managers think it is, and so on. I dwelt on those points at length, and they're quite right. And people like Jax, who want to get things right, say it's so important that these MAHs, these work hierarchies, have fair payment, transparency, and they have a culture which respects the workers, and the workers feel that they're part of something worthwhile.
But I tend to be.
Sorry, I'm finished.
I appreciate that, but I going back to a point I keep making about the viable systems model, and the problem I find with management cybernetics is people don't seem to realize that in the viable systems model, most of the time, people are sitting in the meta system. So in an organization, the managing director is system 5, et cetera, et cetera. And that creates elites in the system. And I'm convinced, having looked at it, that the only good management system is where the systems one, the workers are actually running themselves. They become their own management. They are managing. As soon as you start putting people into the management, they start to become them. And that's what I found in small charities and small religions, is there was no them. In fact, when you asked who was them, they said, we don't know what you mean.
Okay, well, just with respect to the small, I mean, small is beautiful in organisations, certainly, because it's far easier to get a good ethos going. That's true. It's also the case in these organisations. Some people, I mean, there are mixed cases where people are both shareholders and workers within the organisation, so they're being paid at the same time. They've got some role in governance. So it's not mixed. But in some organisations, the chairman of the board is the same person who is the chief executive officer, the chief manager, as it were. But Jax just points out these roles need to be kept apart in terms of good governance and good management. As to at what point the workers take over the organisation, I really don't know how that can work unless people are keeping a clear distinction between their roles. That on the one hand, they're workers who get paid for doing their job, and on the other hand, they're being invited in some capacity to be part of the association, which has agreed to set up an organisation to do work. So,
well, I think Akov showed people in his style for participative management, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one can have representative trade unions as being part of the board. I mean, this is, I'm aware of it. But anyway, I'm not entirely a Jax fan. It's just that many years ago, I was taught by him, and I did a project under his supervision. And because he was head of the department, I did quite a lot of reading about him. So if you're really interested in his ideas, I suggest you look at him more closely, because he claims to be about efficient, effective management of these organisations which are there to get work done. But all the other issues about the culture inside organisations and so on, small and big, I agree with you about that. I agree with you. And it was an early finding of Reg Revens I mentioned last week, that small hospitals retain their nursing staff far better than big hospitals. Small is beautiful. People felt more valued and better cared for and more respected inside the small organisations. So that's, without knowing more about how you envisage this workers' participation in management, I can't say any more. But I'm aware we don't have Shan Turnbull with us, who has been for decades now promoting the idea of forms of cooperative organisation rather than hierarchies. but he's not here to debate.
I think it's more than just, it's a lot to do with creativity. I think modern organizations stifle creativity. They stifle innovation. That the way that roles are created and recreated in an autopoietic way means that what I found as well is depends on how well you fit the role that you have to take on. So you have a personal identity and you have a role identity. And even in some quite interesting religions like the Quakers, where they're very free, they still felt they were stifled by the roles that they had to play. So any organization impacts on your personal identity in some way. But only small organizations allowed people to be really fruitful. So, I mean, the Schumacher Society, who's still perpetuating ideas of Schumacher and small is beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if this group is looking at governance, it's a really important issue because you can't, I don't think you can create a new system of governance and then hope that the people will follow it. It's the other way around. You have to interact with the world and allow that to create the governance.
Okay, just to go back to defending Jacques, he talks very clearly about the tendency of many organisations to push the designers and the the research groups, the creative people down to the bottom of the hierarchy, and they're not really valued properly. And he argues against that. They should be high up and properly integrated. And as I say, he says much about how the people, anybody in the organisation, should feel that they've been fairly treated and have a voice where appropriate. But you're quite right about the personal identity role in that. That's why I spoke at length about the organisational psychology aspect. So that last week. What I would say is that Jacques claims that his concept of the requisite organisation is universally applicable. So you can find examples, as he says, 90% of all employees are part of these things. But he says the problem is that most of them are badly managed and they get confused by all sorts of terms and concepts from management consultants and business schools and so on, which just muddy the water. He actually calls it, it's like a conceptual, can't remember the word he used, a conceptual swamp out there in the world of understanding organisations and how they, or requisite organisations terms. So I just recommend him as someone to look at. But new forms of governance is like, well, what does that mean? Are we talking about the association, the governing body, or are we talking about the part of the system, the organisation which is doing the work? Are we talking about the civil service, or are we talking about members of parliament? You see, it's a okay.
Lucille, your turn. You also have the slides to share this morning. You sent me something.
Yes. But maybe it's better to follow the discussion instead to add new issues. I mean, okay. I'd like to say that I agree with what Klaus said at the beginning, that hospital is not a closed system, but I would just add that every social system has the same properties that Klaus was raising, to say that it is not autopoietic, it's not closed. Exactly, I mean, whatever social system we choose, we will find always the same problem about boundaries, which are permeable, with people coming in and out, being not invariantly keeping into the same organization. We will deal always with the question of the stakeholders, for instance, that is just a relationship with a known system, but again, that is opening the system and making it permeable with the external environment. That is my point I'm trying to claim, is that any social system is closed, any social system has is an autopoietic system. That's why it's just a question of the degree of openness, the degree of autonomy. It's a question of degree, not a question of, not an on-off condition. That was my first point. Second point that I agree as well with Klaus is about the danger of using biological metaphor, not more and not only as a metaphors, but using it as something which is more, that is informing the field of social system. This is very dangerous because there is a strong and ontological difference between biological and social systems. That is one of them. One of these ontological differences is that in biological systems, you cannot have part of the system shared by other different systems. I mean, my arm is my arm and cannot be the arm of another person or another biological system. But in social systems, we have these properties. That is, the same element, the same parts can be shared at the same time by different systems. That is, I call it multi-membership. You can member of a lot of different social systems, while in the biological system, you cannot be member of different biological systems. I mean, but this is only one of the many sharp differences between biological and social systems. And that's why also the use of genotypes or genotypical differences and phenotypical differences is not appropriate when we are talking about social systems, because I challenge everybody to say, okay, show me precisely in a specific system, which could be the hospital, company, whatever you want, what is the genotype and what is the phenotype? So it basically, it is impossible to run this type of analysis.
Let me just, I'm glad that you agree with me, but I would say in general, that is the issue of metaphor. A metaphor is taking the vocabulary from a different domain and produce it on the present one. But the most important part is that it changes of the perception of the present one. One eliminates a lot of other things. And that is a problem when we take a biological metaphor so seriously, then we suddenly don't see that there are people that talk, that they go in and out. And so we ignore that completely. And that's a danger, a procedural danger. And that's what I tried to point out. We have to be very careful with the language that we use. At the same time, I know also metaphors are extremely creative. You know, new technologies are always coming. Someone borrows a metaphor from somewhere else and suddenly something totally new comes. But one has to be very careful when one is actually very little aware of the metaphors we're using.
Sure, agree.
Okay, do you want to hear my story then?
Sure.
Have you?
Please.
Yes.
Yes, very much.